Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 11th of May, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. And although the lower third says that Brian Gerrish is sitting beside me, in fact, he's not. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and Brian is joining me via video link. Welcome to the programme, Brian.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Delighted to be here. And I'll just apologise because, of course, I'm not wearing a tie, but I can tell you I need a jumper where I am. South Wales is quite cold today.
Okay, and I'm delighted to see that just in the nick of time, following some technical issues, David Scott has arrived on the scene. Are you there, David?
Mostly.
Mostly.
Everything
Good.
seems to be kind of working.
Good stuff. Well, we're going to get straight on with the Israeli situation, the Syrian situation, really. David, it staggers me that the mainstream media is blaming Iran for these attacks on the Golan Heights. So this is Sky News. Israel launches counter-strikes after Iran attacks Golan Heights. Not just British press either. Here's France 24 saying the same thing. As it happened, Israel strikes Iranian forces in Syria after Iran shells Golan Heights. And well, it wasn't just the media, because our illustrious leader, Theresa, said, she made a telephone call to Mr. Netanyahu, and she said that she condemned the Iranian rocket attacks against Israeli forces. And she told Bibi Netanyahu that she strongly supports Israel's right to defend itself against Iranian aggression. And she went on to say during that telephone call that she and Mr. Netanyahu agreed it was vital for the international community to continue working together to counter Iran's destabilizing regional activity and for Russia to use its influence in Syria to prevent further Iranian attacks. Well, look, I don't know who's lying here, but I'm just going to remind everybody what the Syrians put out, the Syrian Arab Army put out quite clearly yesterday. This is their statement, which is a summary of the events which led up to the attack on Golan yesterday. And it quite clearly says, the last point is, Syrian military responded by firing a barrage of missiles at Zionist military points inside occupied Golan. So, David, first, as I say, I'm a bit confused by that, by everything that's going on here, because the mainstream media and our illustrious politicians, who would never lie, of course, insist that it was Iran that carried out the rocket attacks in Golan. The Syrians, who never tell the truth, of course, according to the mainstream media, and our politicians say that it was them. So I wonder, do you have any insight into this?
I can offer a little. Bahrain has supported the attacks, quite unusually, Bahrain supporting the Israeli position. Quote, as long as Iran breached the status quo in the region and has yet to evacuate its troops and missiles, any state in the region, including Israel, is entitled to defend itself by destroying the sources of danger. Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed bin Mohammed Al Khalifa. Now, so what he's saying there is that the aggression was not the missiles. The aggression was the presence of Iranians. So if the Iranians are in there, despite the fact that they are in there with the permission of the Syrian government, that doesn't seem to matter. Their presence is the aggression, and their presence gives any state in the area the right to defend itself by attacking them in an unprovoked manner. That seems to be the policy.
Brian, have you got any thoughts on this?
Well, I have, Mike. I mean, the immediate one is that we've seen the West, so certainly being led by UK, but also the United States, France and the EU, constantly lying when it comes to the basis of conflict in a arena. And we've particularly seen the UK and the US lying over weapons of mass destruction in order to get regime change going in Iraq. I think what's happening is very simple. They failed to topple Assad in Syria as a result of the Russian intervention. The agenda is now to try and switch target to Iran, and therefore we're going to see this massive propaganda exercise to try and pin anything on Iran. And the other thing I'm just going to remind our viewers and listeners of course, it was David Cameron who said in the very early days when he became Prime Minister that his loyalty to Israel was unshakable, not to the British people, but to Israel. And that has been followed up by Theresa May. So we have seen a succession of British prime ministers, for whatever reason, showing absolute loyalty to a foreign state. And my argument is always it could be Italy. If they were saying that their loyalty was to Italy over and above the British nation, we'd have a problem. In this case, they're saying it's Israel. Can we expect Theresa May to say anything different? I don't think so. I think that the power of the Israeli lobby within Westminster is very, very powerful indeed. Conservative Friends of Israel boasts of how many MPs it can influence with its requirements, with Israeli requirements, and it's time for this influence to be discussed freely, I think, with the British public. That's my personal opinion.
Indeed, right. David, the Times of Israel here, their headline is Iran. This is Iran's statement that Israeli strikes in Syria are meant to support terrorists. Is Iran wrong by saying this?
I don't think it is. This has a feeling of rationality about it. This is a feeling of truth about it. Why go about launching such a large attack? Now, yes, there probably was some degree of threat to Israeli airspace, Israeli territory, but there's a bigger play here. The overall strategic view that this article is taking is that Israel is interested in creating chaos in surrounding states, is interested in having no security in surrounding states, in order that they have no threats from surrounding states, and therefore they have a policy of destabilization, and that this policy has been worked out here, and as the destabilization policy has failed and the terrorists have been driven back, then we're seeing more direct intervention from Israel's government in order to support those destabilizing elements.
Well, look, the other question is, what else is Israel up to? Well, something which obviously isn't getting any media coverage is the continuing situation between Israel and Palestine. Yesterday evening, I spoke to independent journalist Robert Inlakesh, and Robert's been on the program before talking about this quite some time ago now, and he was speaking to me yesterday about what's been going on, particularly in the West Bank, and he began by discussing the case of a personal friend who has found himself in an Israeli military prison as a result of what's going on in Palestine. So let's have a look at this.
Yes, I wanted to use an example of a friend of mine. His name's Abdul Khalik Burnat. This example is, of course, to represent the greater story of what's going on in Palestine with child prisoners and also just prisoners in general. They're taken by the Israeli state and processed, of course, in a different court system than Israeli Jews. Processed through this brutal military court system. My friend, Abdul Khalik Burnat, who I stayed in the home of for an entire month, was last year taken on the 10th of December. He was 17 years old at the time, and he was brutally arrested with two of his friends whilst they traveled to a neighboring village to get pizza. The Israelis ambushed his car at gunpoint that his friend was driving, yanked them all out of the car. They bound their hands, blindfolded them, beat them up, and threw them into Israeli vehicles, and brought them back to Offer military prison. They kept him there and his two friends for 6 months. They brutalized him, kept him awake late at night, and they tried to intimidate him and coerce him into admitting his supposed crimes that they had him in for by bringing him and arresting his little brother, his 15-year-old brother Mohammed. All of this, 6 months of administrative detention, held without a charge, because he threw stones, they said, and he cut the wall, the top of the wall, the separation wall, the apartheid wall, which illegally cuts into Palestinian land. This is just one case, but I wanted to use this to paint the picture for you of what it's like for Palestinians, just from a personal perspective of somebody I know, a case that I can tell you 100%. I can explain to you the entirety of the story. And also, this is somebody that really means something to me because I spent much time with this person. I'm very good friends with him. In fact, the day before he was arrested, I was on call to him and he was talking about his aspirations to study. Of course, this has all been destroyed for him now because he's in prison. He's just been sentenced to 19 months in an Israeli military prison and had the equivalent of 1,500 US dollars smacked on him as a fine for, they say, cutting the apartheid wall, the fence at the top of the apartheid wall, and throwing stones.
A $1,500 fine. What's the average salary where he lives? Is this an achievable sum of money for him or for his family?
Well, in terms of the average amount of salary, I mean, there's a lot of people that I'd say the bulk of people in the area are either unemployed or they have very minimal work. There's not many jobs there at all. And to attain that amount of money, the only way they can get this is basically by if somebody donates it to them. They're not going to acquire this sort of money by themselves. This village where he's from, Belaine, people aren't, I suppose, as impoverished as some places in the West Bank. You see a lot of places in the West Bank that I've visited villages that have just been rolled over with bulldozers. That in Area C, for example, of the West Bank, there's 3 different areas, A, B, and C. Area C, which takes up 60% of the West Bank, you can't have a water supply to your village because the Israelis stopped that. You can't have like electricity to your village because the Israelis stopped that. But in general, the conditions are horrendous, and the salaries. I mean, to make money there, it's on and off, and it's hit and miss as to whether you will make money or you've got to go out of your way, maybe even work in settlements to make money. It's almost impossible to attain this, and the only reason they give them fines like this, huge fines, massive fines that people in Western countries would, if we got this sort of fine slapped on us for something like throwing a stone at something, we'd be, in a bit of strife ourselves. I mean, it would be difficult for a lot of people to cough up some of the sums that they throw at Palestinians, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, for just tiny little things. He threw a stone, he breached the security of the settlement, or whatever it may be. It's insane. The only reason they do this is to impoverish the Palestinians, to push them further into poverty, to make their lives more difficult, to make it more unbearable, so that they can push them out of their homes and make them leave their land, essentially.
What happens if he doesn't pay this amount of money?
If he doesn't pay this sort of money, then they can just hold him in the military prison.
Okay, so he's been accused of throwing stones. So on his side, he's got stones. What are the Israelis using to deal with this type of civil unrest?
Well, they're using, of course, the likes of M16s. They've got many different types of weapons that they use in the West Bank. Of course, that they'll use on nonviolent demonstrators. There's very, very rarely any attacks against the Israeli military in the West Bank. You can count on one hand the amount that have occurred within the past year. And for this, they use deadly force. They use snipers that they'll set up in peaceful demonstrations I've been involved in myself. They've set snipers on the roofs and shot down, and I've witnessed this with my own eyes. They'll fire tear gas at you. A friend of mine, his sister was killed by tear gas inhalation. So for people to tell you that this tear gas, in particular the one that the Israelis use, and the sheer volume of tear gas that they use, because they don't just shoot 1 or 2 gas canisters, they'll shoot hundreds of gas canisters, and they've got sophisticated technology as to how they can deliver this to you as well. And the tear gas is banned by international law that they're using. It's an internationally banned weapon. They're using it on demonstrators all the time. Not only that, this is every single day. They're using rubber-coated steel bullets, and it's just these bullets are basically, if you split them open, I split them open myself, and I've had them fired at me. These bullets are a thin coat of rubber, and on the inside it's a steel bullet. Also, they use what they call sponge bullets. This is very misleading. Also, my friend, who I've just been talking about, who's been sentenced to 19 months in an Israeli military prison, was shot in the back of the head with one of these supposed sponge bullets. Basically, the very head of the bullet is sponge. The back of the bullet is a canister. It's a big canister, that's what this is, and it spins. And many people have been killed by this, and you've really got to be lucky if you're ever going to get hit with that sponge, because the bullet is designed like that, so it spins and it hits you, and it cracked the back of my friend's skull open. Then, as he was recovering, my friend, from his injury, being shot in the back of the head with this bullet that they call non-lethal, and supposedly, just to control riots or whatever they claim, they came and they arrested him and deprived him of the medicine that he was taking in order to recover from his head wound.
You say that these are considered to be non-lethal weapons, but you've also said that many people have died from being struck by them. Have you any idea of what the mortality rate is with these things?
It depends as to whether the Israelis are trigger happy at a different time of the year. Perhaps maybe the demonstrations are a bit bigger. Maybe they're just feeling like shooting people, so they'll at random shoot people and kill them. It really does depend. I mean, you can get caught up in this tear gas if you get caught up in a cloud of tear gas. One of my friends, his name is Ashraf Abu Rahma. He's also from Bilain, a village that I spent considerable amount of time in when I was in the West Bank. His sister was killed after she was caught up in a cloud of tear gas. Just to give you a sort of a feel for how generally this is used, you will see this if you're in Hebron, a place in the West Bank called Hebron. You will see this gas used almost every single day, every day. And when I was there, I witnessed multiple times soldiers coming at night into villages. I saw this with my own eyes, and firing not only gas into the streets, but into people's homes and through their windows, into their homes whilst they're sleeping. And of course, if you get tear gassed whilst you're sleeping, definitely this can be lethal force used against you. Of course, they pass this off as non-lethal force, but you can be killed by these weapons that they use, these so-called rubber bullets. If you're too close to a rubber bullet and get shot in the head, you're going to die. A gas canister, for instance, was fired again with my friend, the same friend whose sister was killed, Ashraf Abu Rahma. His brother, Bassem, was shot in the heart with a tear gas canister by the Israelis, and it crushed his rib cage into his heart and killed him. So these weapons that they're using, you mentioned the mortality rate. I don't have a specific statistic for you as to how many are killed as per how many days or how many are on average or like that. But it depends upon the circumstance. And if these demonstrations start picking up, then they'll go ahead and kill more and more people.
Robert, as I say, it's quite some time since you've been on the UK column news, and the picture doesn't seem to improve. I mean, how do you see things going here on it? Do you think Trump is going to have any impact on this, or is there any serious negotiation likely in the foreseeable future, or is this violence just going to escalate to a point where where the Israelis are killing enough people that solves the problem for them?
Well, the Israelis are always going to approach it the same way. They don't believe in their racist mindset, this state, that you can reason with Arabs or Palestinians, that you can approach them. They don't believe this. This is not the sort of ideology of the state. The ideology of the state is that these are all animals, these are all lower people than us, and we need to push them off the land And for the ones that aren't actively wanting to push them off the land, they just completely ignore them. They dehumanize these people. And in terms of a negotiation, of course, Trump is moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. Of course, this is not to do with peace at all, but the two-state solution is a delusion. The West Bank is split up into three areas. Let's just look at the West Bank. It's split up into three different areas, A, B, and C. Just to give you a rough sort of picture of what's going on, Area C takes up 60% of the West Bank. In Area C, there's more settlers than there is Palestinians because they've either been driven out or the Israelis have just came in and just dominated that area and built it up with more settlements. And the Israeli population is growing and growing and growing. And there's only these very small pockets of Palestinians that live, and it's not contiguous at all. For Israel, the whole state is Israel. And the project is making it all their land. They already believe it's all their land. And the only trouble spot for them is the Gaza Strip. So I think we can expect some sort of operation, something targeting the Gaza Strip now. But in terms of negotiations, I can't see the Israeli state negotiating because it's a settler colonial project. The aims of the state are not to include Palestinians as human beings. Even Israeli Jews who are of Middle Eastern background and Ethiopian Jewish background are not considered as equals. It's a settler colonial project. They don't want to reason, and you can't reason with this. So, I mean, the only solution is either further military campaigns in terms of Israel's view as they want to continue, or they just make conditions so hard they hope people leave. At the moment, we can expect to see more violence, but eventually it's going to turn on Israel, I believe, because the demographic, they can't sustain this. The majority of Israeli Jews are there's an ever-growing population of Middle Eastern Jews in Israel. And this is overcoming the white European Jewish population. Also, within the state of Palestine now, or whether you like to call it Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank, there's more Palestinian Arabs than there is Israelis. And this demographic is going to pose a huge threat. Could you imagine when the Arab Israelis, the Palestinians with Israeli citizenships, suddenly there's more of them and they still have this voting right? There's going to be a Palestinian leadership. So they've either got to expel people on a mass scale and use some sort of conflict or anything to cover this up, or they're going to be overcome by the demographics. So there is hope yet. But what we can see in the near future, I believe, is just further violence.
Yeah. Well, David, I'm sure you'll have some comments about that, but Robert mentioned the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the Jerusalem Post here, the headline is Palestinians announce embassy move date to be a day of rage. We've discussed this issue of the embassy move before. And this is a pretty insightful move. So give me some thoughts on what Robert was saying and on this article.
Excuse me. Yeah, on the article, first of all, the most interesting point in the article was a Palestinian security official who spoke on the condition of anonymity told Jerusalem Post, quote, "We want to maintain calm and stability, and we plan to do that in the upcoming weeks. We do not have an interest in returning to the destruction of the Second Intifada." Now, what you see here is realism and a far more astute response from the Palestinian side than before, because essentially all the bombs are with the Israeli side. They really have got the very modern military, large military, well organized, well armed, and the Palestinians have one bomb. It's the demographic bomb, because within the borders of Palestine, as was, the numbers are roughly equal between Arabs and Jews. So the situation is that the Jewish state, in order to maintain the basic principle of democratic and Jewish, has to deny Palestinians voting rights and normal civil rights within the land in which they're living. And there is now a realization, I think, in the Palestinian political world that this is something that can be fought politically. Can't be fought militarily, but it can be fought in terms of an appeal to a global community who will recognise the manifest unfairness of this, and they'll be pushing along those lines. Now, there are other schisms and problems, because if you read the 1937 Royal Commission report into Palestine, it's still essentially, it could have been written today. Right? The basic problem they saw was that you had two peoples who would not live together. They concluded that you had to partition the country and give them both a peace. That process has failed. The comment there that the two-state solution is a myth, it certainly is now. If it was ever possible, and it might have been in maybe 1967, 68, it's not now. There have been many attempts at a two-state solution, and what we're left with now is de facto one state, de facto one capital, and a position where a large percentage of the Arab part of the population must be denied voting and civil rights in order that the founding principles of the state, that it must be both Jewish and democratic, are maintained.
And have you any thoughts on what Robert was reporting?
It's very common. It's very tragic. It's something we see over and over, that there is a sectarianism, there is a hatred for the other that is manifest on a huge level through the arms of the Israeli state, and this means that you do not have reasonable protection in law. You do not have a reasonable response to events. The responses are unreasonable. The responses are deadly, where deadly force is in no way required, and we see it over and over and over again. And the basic message there, that the policy is to make life so uncomfortable that these people leave, I think that's correct. I think that is the policy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, David, and thanks to Robert for joining us last night. Hopefully, we'll see him again in the not too distant future. Now, let's move on to defence and Jeremy Corbyn. Brian, Jeremy Corbyn has called for Navy shipbuilding contracts to stay in the UK. This is the article from the Labour Party website, and it says, in a speech in Govan, Glasgow today, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn will insist that 3 new Royal Fleet auxiliary vessels must be built in British shipyards. Labour's demand comes as the UK government is preparing to put the £1 billion contract for building these ships out to international tender. Securing this £1 billion investment for the UK shipyards would create around 6,500 jobs and also support other British industries, including steel. So that's what he's talking about. Well, how did the mainstream media react to this? Hypocrite, says the Express. Hypocrite, pacifist Jeremy Corbyn urges Ministry of Defence to build 3 new Royal Navy ships. And that's their headline. It doesn't say anything about building them here. So this is an unbelievable headline. Brian, first of all, I don't really see any problem. I don't see how it's hypocritical for somebody who's a pacifist to say that the Ministry of Defence should be building ships in this country.
Well, of course, that's absolutely right. If we agree that we have got some form of defence in this country, and you support that state of affairs, then you've obviously got to make sure that the defence forces are equipped. But of course, what we're seeing here follows on very quickly from what we reported yesterday, which was the EU, it would appear, being terrified of Britain starting to look after its own interests in the first place. So I think this is not just an attack, as it were, by British mainstream media. This is on the back of those European fears that we could start to re-engage British industry. I believe those ships most certainly should be built in Britain. And of course, that process does not just mean that whatever it is, 6,000 people have jobs. This is part of the process that if a nation builds ships, for example, then you're going to have a whole training process for that workforce around ongoing work. This is what apprenticeships are about. This is This is the whole process of taking young people who perhaps don't want to go through a university education. They want to come and do something with their hands. They want skills. All of those processes happen around Britain building its own infrastructure. It could be ships, it could be railway, rolling stock, it could be bridges. It doesn't matter what it is, but there is a point at which you have to say, for a country, for a nation to function, it has to be able to build its own infrastructure, its own facilities. But I would say to Mr. Corbyn, if he really believes that he's looking after the British workforce, of course, it's not just building the ships. He's also got to protect the steel plants that are going to produce British steel in order to build those ships.
Yeah, sorry, Brian, in fairness, he does say exactly that.
Oh, he does? Okay,
yes.
Well, okay. Well, I was just going to add, with a smile on my face, isn't it amazing that we've seen the young Kinnock, who's supposedly Stephen Kinnock, who's supposedly been a mainstay of the Labour Party, working with Tata Steel. So at the time when we thought the Labour Party would be reinforcing jobs in British steel production in South Wales, we had the Kinnocks, supposedly hard Labour supporters, working to help facilitate the work of Tata Steel in India. So there's something still not right with what's going on in the Labour Party. Is he saying this because he actually believes it, or is he saying it because he thinks it's going to win votes and get him into power? I don't know. But what I will say is that if this country is to actually start to get a grip of itself, we need to be building things. We need to be building ships, not only warships. We need to be building merchant ships. We need to be building railway rolling stock. We need to be producing cars. We need to be producing aircraft. And of course, traditionally, we've had a fantastic skills base to do that. How have those skill bases fallen? Well, they've been taken apart by deliberate government policy, be it Labour or Conservative.
Indeed. Now let's just bring people up to date on what's going on with European Defence Union. A couple of days ago, European Defence. This is from the European Union External Action. European Defence, 17 cooperation projects underway, more to follow later in 2018. So the EU Ministers of Defence were meeting informally in Sofia a week or so ago. They reviewed advances in the framework for permanent structured cooperation, that's PESCO, in the field of defence, and discussed new projects to build further on the rapid progress made over the last 2 years. Ms. Mogherini said, we have decided to adopt a new wave of projects later this year. This shows the level of commitment but also satisfaction that member states have in the process we have launched. And she went on to say that an overview of implementation of each of the projects will be made public before the European Council meeting in June. So we look forward to that. But something which has been rumbling on for quite some time now is this idea of a military Schengen zone. And that hit the mainstream press in March, actually, this year, and was followed up with other statements from the EU themselves. EU outlines plans for military Schengen zone. The EU wants to streamline military improvements across the bloc and make infrastructure more suitable for military use. The plan has been dubbed a military Schengen, a reference to Europe's passport-free travel zone. They've unveiled plans to lower barriers by moving military equipment and troops across Europe amid rising concerns of Russian aggression, of course. The 28-member bloc has sought to better integrate defence capabilities. So just say that again, the 28-member bloc, so DW in their reporting of this, absolutely including the United Kingdom. But this idea of a military Schengen zone has been promoted several times. It's been going on for quite some time now. Here is European Defence Matters. I think this goes back to the middle of last year. Europe needs a military Schengen. We have the European Union Institute for Military Studies towards a military Schengen. We have External Action again, Defence EU moves on military mobility. And we have Defending Europe. This is a paper from the European Commission, Defending Europe, Improving Military Mobility in the European Union. By 2025, according to Mr. Juncker, we need a fully fledged military union. Now, what does he say? Creating a fully fledged European Defence Union by 2025 is imperative to Europe's security and to build a union that protects. A smooth, efficient, and effective movement of military personnel and assets across and beyond the EU will enhance the EU's preparedness in response to crises. It will enable EU member states to act faster in line with their defence needs and responsibilities, both in the context of the common security and defence policy missions and operations, and the framework of national and multinational activities. Currently, cross-border mobility is still hampered by a number of barriers that can lead to delays, disruption, higher costs, or increased vulnerability. But that's a pretty definitive statement. Brian, by 2025, we now have a deadline.
Well, basically, Mike, of course, nothing has changed. The agenda of the European Union was to create a full unified military structure. As we've said over several years now, this is the reason that Britain's armed forces were cut and cut and cut. It was to achieve so-called parity, balance between the strength of the British military and other European nations, particularly France, with regard to the size of our navy. And that was the agenda. It has never changed. And Theresa May and her government utterly lying to the British people, because despite all the talk about Brexit, this is still going on. We've got continued integration of military units. We've got continued, integration of British research and development with European projects. We've got the sharing of equipment. We've even had recently the admission that the new aircraft carrier, Queen Elizabeth, cannot work simply with Royal Navy ships because there aren't enough. And so when Queen Elizabeth is deployed, she will have to have the protection of other European military units. So this has gone on apace. David Ellis of Strategic Defence Initiatives has warned and warned about this. And of course, it also makes the movement towards the treasury system for the European Union. So despite anything and everything that the government says, the British government says, we are not separating Britain's military from the European Union. We are rapidly moving it towards full integration. This is one of the biggest lies that any government has carried out on the British nation since people were lured into the common market, which of course was the first step towards this European supranational state.
Well, we'll be coming on to more of the lies over Brexit and the EU shortly. But briefly, quick reminder, final reminder that tomorrow is the Dying for Good Health conference in the Albert Hall in Nottingham. Absolutely get along to that if you possibly can. Tickets are still on sale online. If you can buy a ticket online, please do so, because that helps us get people through the doors and into the hall as quickly as possible. But if you do need to get a ticket on the door, please make sure you allow yourself plenty of time. Brian, I believe we're starting 10 a.m. sharp.
Yeah, absolutely. We've no idea the numbers that are going to turn up on the day. Many people want to buy a ticket on the day. So I'm going to say, if you are doing that and you're going to pay at the door, please come early so that we can get people through. And the doors will be open at 9 o'clock. In fact, maybe a little bit before that. So don't be late.
Okay, David, Scottish Issues Now named person scheme. Just briefly remind us what the named person scheme was all about.
The named person scheme is a state-appointed guardian for every child in Scotland. This person was to collate and be a central point of contact to gather information that anybody could provide: teachers, health visitors, the man who comes from the housing department, taxi drivers, whoever happens to see something about your family and has a gut feel that something might need to be done by the state, not based on any welfare concern, based on well-being, which is not defined and can mean whatever you want it to mean. So there's essentially an ability for the state to inquire into every child and every associated adult in Scotland as much as they deem necessary. and this was ruled unlawful and finally struck down by the UK Supreme Court. And we're now dealing with the aftermath.
And part of that is a petition, an inquiry into the human rights impact of the GERFEC policy and data processing. And it looks like your good lady wife is driving that forward.
She's one of the people who've come up with this petition, yes. Now, this is currently live on the Scottish Government website. It's live until, I think, middle of June, so we'd encourage people to get along and sign it to show your support. Now, the issues that come here, and quoting Leslie here, my wife, she said, we need to know how our rights can be so easily overridden despite our history as a nation that values freedom. Where were the checks and balances? Why did no one in authority resist? Where is the accountability in government? And Jane Colby of the Times Trust said, who's ultimately to blame for this fiasco? Will anyone put their hands up and resign? Who will apologise to the families? So what this is a demand for is an inquiry into all of the illegal data sharing that has gone on and is going on, why it happened, why did the Information Commissioner, for example, give it the thumbs up and let it all go through, who made the decisions, and how is the system which has been created to be unpicked and the damage repaired.
Has there been any discussion in Scotland over how the new data protection legislation that's come in via the European Union, one of the areas that we will not be leaving when we leave the European Union, has there been any discussion about how that impacts name person scheme?
Well, by the No to Name Person campaign, it's been pointed out, in government circles, there seems to be terrified silence.
Okay, let's move on then to the Fresh Start Foundation next event taking place tomorrow. Where's this taking place?
Yes, this is in Pennycook in Midlothian. And the main speaker, it's the Ladywood Leisure Centre in Pennycook. And it's on Saturday, as you said, 11 till 3. The main speaker is Fresh Start Foundation's director, Janine Rennie. Now, Janine's also chief operating officer of a major charity in Scotland, and has been fighting on behalf of the people harmed by child sexual abuse and Satanist ritual abuse for decades. And she's going to be talking about that experience. She's going to be explaining the sort of opposition that she has received from local government, from central government, and the pressure that's being applied and is still being applied to silence anyone who speaks out on behalf of those who are harmed, anyone who actually wants to stop the harm. It's going to be a very interesting talk. If anyone in the Edinburgh or Central Scotland area who can make it along, please come along. You will all be welcome.
Well, if that's the People's Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse still going on, the government inquiry is also still going on. How much progress is being made here?
It is slow. What we've got just now, this is phase 2 of the evidence sessions, and phase 2 is dealing only with one institution, which is Nazareth House, which was a convent-operated network of children's homes, formerly operating in Scotland, and where there has been horrendous abuse. I noticed recently a councillor in Aberdeen, was one of these homes was in Aberdeen, a councillor in Aberdeen saying that the level of abuse was an open secret throughout the council. The council, of course, did nothing to stop it. And this is one of the things that constantly puzzles me, because to have the level of abuse that's been discussed, you need to have failure on so many levels. It's not just that there must be people in the children's homes who are abusive, but the entire management structure of those institutions must be complicit, and the local authorities. It's impossible for the local authorities not to know, and the police, and the Crown Office, and the judiciary. You have to have all of these levels of protection that are meant to save these children from predatory and evil people. They all have to fail simultaneously, and they all did fail simultaneously.
Okay, now you've got a book recommendation here, just changing the subject slightly. This is called Acid Attack, a journalist war with organised crime. Is this about organised crime in Scotland?
Yes and no. It is about organised crime in Scotland, but what it's really about is, in fact, those same institutions in Scotland. It covers quite a lot of child sexual abuse issues as well. It covers failures within the police. It covers corruption within the Crown Office. It covers corruption within the legal system. It's a fantastic book. If anyone who lives in Scotland needs to read this book, it's absolutely essential, because you have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know the nature of the society and the nature of the institutions that are surrounding you. It's absolutely first class. Written by Russell Finlay, who was the victim of the acid attack. He was set upon by a hitman, and who was there with a knife as well as acid. So there seemed to be it was going to be his life, and carefully planned attack, which he managed to stop, and he managed to overpower the hitman, who was then arrested. And this was someone sent by an organised crime figure, a gangster in central Scotland. But it's the wider links from organised crime into all aspects of society that this book reveals, and is very worthwhile because of that.
And what happens when people try to blow the whistle on activities within these institutions?
Well, this is fascinating. Now, this next article here is again from Russell Finlay, the author of that book. Now, this is PC Karen Harper. Right, she talks about Police Scotland, and she felt, now this is a police officer, long-serving police officer with a spotless record. She wanted some time off. She wanted some flexible working hours, because I think it was her mother was very ill, or she'd been bereaved or something like this. And she describes Police Scotland as acting like the mafia, and this is not wrong. It's amazing the sort of efforts that were used to attack this woman when she complained about the way she was being treated, complaining, blowing the whistle. This was just not to be accepted. She was bullied over flexible working. She complained about the bullying. There was a very brief inquiry by a chief inspector. The conclusion was, there's nothing to see here, move along. She decided that she wasn't going to accept that. She was going to look for legal redress. She said, quote, "My shift colleagues were great, but from the moment I arrived, the sergeant made my life hell. I eventually complained, and he was quickly cleared by the chief inspector." So, unsatisfied with this complaint, she notified the police that she was considering legal action. 3 days later, 2 professional standards department officers approached her ex-husband, Bruce Harper, also a former police officer, to ask if he would make a complaint against her. So they're digging for dirt. She then found out that the police standards department officers had contacted her colleagues and visited 15 of her neighbours in a bid to find any evidence of criminality or misconduct. Saying things like, "Can you advise me if you know PC Karen Harper? Have you ever had any dealings on or off duty?" So the whole thing was to fit her up. Now it gets worse, because she then went to the Scottish Police Authority. Scottish Police Authority are the overseeing body, and they've been called Stalinist, and it's like the Kremlin, and it's a secret society. But it's okay. It's okay. We've got a new head. The new chair is Susan Deacon. So this officer wrote to Susan Deacon and a private email, and it was in fact answered by an underling. So she complained about that and said, no, this was for Susan Deacon's eyes only. And she was again answered by an underling. And when she asked, "Is this how you treat whistleblowers?" they didn't even answer her at all. And then to really put the tin lid on it, who should be in her corner? The Scottish Police Federation, the trade union for police officers. They dropped her case, so she had to find £45,000 herself for the legal bills. So there you go. You blow the whistle in Scotland, and you appear to be on your own. But the organised mafia of Police Scotland will fish around and will investigate you, and they will find something on you.
Yes. Okay. Good stuff. Right. We shall leave it there. We'll leave the Scottish issues there. We're rapidly running out of time, but I just want to bring this in. Now, this is Margot James, who's currently the digital minister, and she's saying there, it's vital that we put in place tough new measures to strengthen the UK's cybersecurity and make sure we are the safest place in the world to live and be online. Now, this isn't just about cybersecurity. This, in fact, is what the government are describing as new measures to protect health, water, energy, transport, and digital infrastructure against cyber threats and report breaches and network outages. And these are coming into force today. And this is new legislation which comes into force today. They say new measures to protect critical infrastructure and digital services from cyber attacks come into force today. Bosses of firms of health, water, energy, transport, and digital infrastructure will now be expected to have robust safeguards in place against cyber threats and report breaches and network outages to regulators within 72 hours, or they face fines of up to £17 million. The new law announced by the Digital Minister Margot James will help reduce the number of damaging cyber attacks affecting the UK, and it's all going to be managed through the National Cybersecurity Centre, which of course is a part of GCHQ, set up in October 2016. But Brian, just to end the programme here, what staggered me about this, of course, you might think, would you not, that protection of critical infrastructure would be something that the British government would be right on top of. But no, this new legislation is not a piece of British legislation at all. It's actually the NIS directive, which is an EU directive, which the UK finally decided to implement on the security of network and information systems. Network and information systems and the essential services they support play a vital role in society, from ensuring the supply of electricity and water. I can't even be bothered to read that. But the point here is it's Brexit without the exit again, because rather than finding our own solutions to the issue of protecting national infrastructure, critical infrastructure, we're merely taking the EU's approach to this and implementing it because we're leaving the EU.
Well, that's true, Mike. There's that angle on it, but I'm going to say the other angle on it is that we are constantly told about the threat of these attacks. It's all ramping up the fear. I say, where is the evidence? Has the British public ever been shown any irrefutable evidence, technical evidence of massive cyber attacks? Because to my knowledge, we haven't seen any evidence at all. We hear stories about it in the paper. We get so-called security people saying it's happening, or it has happened, or we have foiled these attacks, but we never see any evidence. And the reason we never see any evidence is because this is a propaganda exercise. This is about tightening cyber systems to suppress the population. It's nothing to do with protecting us. And of course, the EU, as the supranational dictatorship, wants that sort of technology as well.
I don't think we can say it has never happened. It's certainly not on the scale that the government is suggesting. That's absolutely true. I mean, the one example that they cite in this document is the WannaCry attack on the National Health Service. But Brian, the point here is that the National Health Service was running computers that were 20 years out of date. Certainly hadn't had any security updates, basic security updates on there. So the question then is, where did that cyber attack come from? That's one, but where are all the others that as you say, suggest that we need to be fearful of these things?
Well, I take your point on that, Mike, and I'll just say as a personal opinion, it seems to me it's remarkable that the only one they can sort of show happening, but they can't say the source of it, was the NHS. Why do I think it happened to the NHS? Because this was a big emotive issue for the public. They thought that if they could say to the public, there are people out there prepared to do a cyber attack on the NHS, we can bring in all this legislation. So I take your point, but I still have a suspicion that actually this was partly a created incident. NHS old computers certainly therefore vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, look, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Brian. Thank you, David Scott. And thank you to Robert Inlakesh for speaking to me last night, as we showed earlier in the programme. And we will be back as usual at 1 p.m. on Monday. Thanks for joining us and have a good weekend. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.